Hi everyone, and welcome to this assessment briefing webinar aimed at supporting you with completing assessment 5016 as part of your CMI Level 5 Coaching and Mentoring Certificate. I'm Karen, an Associate Coach and Learning Facilitator, and I support Boo Coaching and Consulting in delivering CMI coaching and mentoring programs. The aims and objectives of this webinar are to help you understand the learning outcomes and assessment criteria for Assessment 5016 and how to tackle these. We'll discuss how best to start your research and suggest some sources that you might find helpful. We'll also talk a little bit about structure and presentation, and finally we'll finish with talking about word count and how best to manage this. There are some sections within this webinar that are repeated in each of the assessment briefings, just in case you hadn't watched one of these before, but feel free to skip over to the particular assessment criteria and learning outcomes for this assessment if you've already watched these. So Assessment 5016 is about using coaching and mentoring skills as a manager. There are 4 learning outcomes that you need to be able to address. So firstly, be able to determine how learning and development styles support the coaching and mentoring practice, and underneath there sit 5 assessment criterion. Be able to develop skills as a manager in coaching and mentoring, and another 5 assessment criterion here. Thirdly, be able to articulate and develop a coherent ethical framework to support coaching within an organisation, and 3 assessment criteria to address here. And finally, articulate the same for mentoring within an organisation, and 3 assessment criteria to address here. So you could join these 2 learning outcomes together. As I mentioned, each learning outcome is broken down into a number of assessment criteria, and you need to pass all of the assessment criteria to pass the assessment. The assessment criteria cover both coaching and mentoring, and it's really important that you pay attention when addressing the assessment criteria to the command words. And here you can see the command words are determine, review, construct. It's normally the first word in the assessment criteria. You can find the definitions of the command verbs in the Candidate Handbook on page 33. And they're also on the CMI website and in the syllabus for your qualification. You might find it really helpful to have a look at these and find out all the different definitions, because they require different skills depending on whether you're being asked to describe or whether you're being asked to evaluate, for example. An evaluate question is likely to be a lot more in depth, and it's going to be asking you for arguments for and against and a little conclusion, whereas if you get something like an identify, it's going to be more a simple answer where you may be just looking at the origins or nature or characteristics of something. So the common ones in your assessments are assess, evaluate, discuss, explain and identify. When you're addressing the criteria, be sure to back up your answers with your wider reading and also examples from your organisation which really show your understanding. Try to stick very carefully to what the criteria is asking for and keep everything written that's relevant to this rather than going off on a tangent. The learning outcomes and assessment criteria are organised into an assessment brief. This is to make it easier to address the assessment criteria. You may find that assessment criteria from different learning outcomes are organised into one task, as with this assessment. It would be helpful to start your assessment with a brief overview of the organisational context. This can be included in an introduction and won't be included in your word count. If you don't have an organisation you can write about, you can use the scenario provided, where you imagine that you are a middle manager with responsibility for assisting your organisation in compiling the business case for coaching and mentoring, and then planning it and implementing it and then monitoring the new approach. So you can write about that scenario, or you can write about your own organisation or an organisation that you know well. You'll find it very helpful to refer to the syllabus when completing your assessment, as this gives you lots of hints and tips within the good practice guidance as to how to address the assessment criteria. It is a really big document, but if you search for the assessment number, you'll soon find the right section for your assessment. So let's have a look at the brief for this particular assessment. The assessment is organised around 3 tasks. For each task, try to back up your answers with relevant theory and examples from the organisation that you're basing the assessment on. There are some criteria that can group together and address together whilst ensuring that you still talk about coaching and mentoring. There's an example here. So assessment criteria 1.2 and 1.3 are almost the same question, but the first one, so 1.2, looks at coaching and 1.3 looks at mentoring. So you can join those together as long as you're covering both coaching and mentoring. So for task 1, there are 5 assessment criteria and the word count is at the maximum 900 words. You can go around 10% over, but just be careful not to go too much over that. And if you divide that 900 up by the 5 assessment criteria, it's roughly 180 words per assessment criterion. So for 1.1, you need to determine your own learning style and also that of one or more team members, or you can use a colleague or even a coachee or mentee. You need to be able to apply some of the relevant theory around learning styles here. And a helpful place to look is on Management Direct. Here I've searched for learning styles and you can see there's 3 different theories come up. These are really common sort of popular theories around learning styles, and one of the particular ones that you could use is Honey and Mumford's learning styles. It helps us understand our own learning preferences, and you can find, if you search for it, there is often a questionnaire that you can use. So if you Google Honey and Mumford learning styles questionnaire, you could use this for yourself or for your team member or colleague. So for 1.1, you should be contrasting your own style with the person or people that you've chosen. So for example, if you come out as an activist, how does that differ to someone who might be a reflector? What are the differences in the way that you like to learn? Another popular model that you could use is VAC learning styles, and you can find some information again on Management Direct. Once you've discovered what your own and your colleagues' learning styles are, you need to then look at what the impact of this is on coaching and mentoring programs for assessment criteria 1.2 and 1.3. So when you're developing a coaching and mentoring program for yourself or for individuals, what are the differences depending on their learning style? How might you approach it in a different way? So for example, if they were an activist, they might want to get really involved in the learning, as opposed to if they're a reflector, they might want to sit back, observe, do some reading and research. So thinking about the different learning styles and how these impact on coaching and mentoring programs. Try and use lots of practical examples to support these 2 sections. Once you've identified learning styles, you need to create 2 different plans. One that's going to support coaching and one that will support mentoring activities, and taking into account the different learning styles of the individuals that you've assessed. You might want to use a table to put together the learning plan. And there is some guidance on Management Direct on constructing personal development plans. So you should have a plan that includes goals and objectives that are going to be achieved, what are the activities, and what are the timescales that you're going to be working towards. And just really make sure that those objectives are SMART. And again, on Management Direct, there is some guidance around SMART if you want to read up a little bit more or just want a refresher. With the 2 plans, just make sure there is a real distinction between the coaching activities and mentoring activities. Task 2 is all about assessing your own capabilities around coaching and mentoring. For 2.1 and 2.2, you need to assess your own skills around communication and people development in order to be able to effectively support people in coaching and mentoring. There are lots of different tools that you could use to help you assess your communication and people development skills. In your coaching and mentoring handbook that you've been provided with as part of your qualification, there's an example of a self-reflection checklist on page 33. That could be a useful tool that you could use to help you self-assess. There are also some tools that you could use on Management Direct as well. Something like a SWOT analysis might also be useful for 2.1 or 2.2. The aim of this really is to highlight what are your strengths and what are your development areas. It might be useful to get some feedback as well from a colleague or a line manager around some of these skills. You might want to support your assessment with some of the theory around communication, for example looking up Morabian on Management Direct. If you've already made a really good start on your coaching practice, you might also want to use your reflective logs to help you reflect and consider what your strengths and weaknesses are. What you then need to do is to look at what those development opportunities are to help you improve and develop your own practice. So for 2.4 and 2.5, you're evaluating the skills and practices, so looking at those strengths, looking at those development areas, and then putting together a personal development plan that's going to help you develop both coaching and mentoring skills. So just make it clear that you're covering both types of skills. As I mentioned earlier, there is some guidance on Management Direct on completing a personal development plan. You could use a template that looks a little bit like this. If you're unsure, just get in touch with us at the CMI email address and we can send you a template that you could use, or you can construct your own. There are some other templates in the Coaching and Mentoring Handbook. On page 32 you'll find a reflective log. As I mentioned, a reflection might be quite helpful for this section. And on page 35 there's a coaching record that you might also find useful. Again, when you're creating your personal development plan, just make sure that the objectives are SMART. So moving on to task 3, there's a word count of around 950 words. So dividing that by the 6 assessment criteria, it gives you roughly 158 words per assessment criterion. You can again join some of these together where it's a similar question but just asks you about coaching and mentoring. So here you can see 3.1 and 4.1 are almost the same question, but one asks you to talk about mentoring and one asks you to talk about coaching. So for 3.1 and 4.1, you're developing a code of ethics that you could apply to coaching and mentoring. If you have a look on page 38 of the Coaching and Mentoring Handbook, you'll find that we've provided you with the Global Code of Ethics from the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. You can also find this on their website. What you might want to do here is summarise some of the key points. Obviously not covering it word for word, but covering some of the key points within a code of ethics that you could apply to your organisation. If you are using this to base your code of ethics on, you'll also want to reference it, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. So again, 3.2 and 4.2 are essentially the same question, but one applies to coaching and one to mentoring. And here you need to analyse the impact of personal and organisational beliefs on coaching and mentoring. You need to ensure that it shows some of the differences between the impact on coaching versus mentoring. And you need to also consider your own values as well as those values of your organisation. So for example, your own values might be that you value integrity. And this will really help you create an environment of confidentiality and trust. But if someone has a really different value to your own, that might be a real challenge for you, and it might be difficult for you to suspend judgment and ensure that you're not making any assumptions. So you really need to think about how you work with an individual who does have very different values and how you'd ensure that you maintain that professional sort of approach, and when might those values be sort of crossed, and when might there be a point where actually it isn't appropriate for you to coach or mentor that individual. In your organisation, you may have a set of values or behaviours that everybody is expected to work towards. You might want to outline how this impacts on coaching and mentoring activity. 3.3 and 4.3 again are the same question, but one applies to coaching, one to mentoring. And here you need to evaluate personal performance and ways that you'd actually deal with beliefs, values, diversity and conflicts of interest. It'd be really helpful for you here to go back to the Global Code of Ethics and look at some of the different headings here, which would give you some suggestions on how you'd actually go about dealing with some of these issues. During your coaching practice, you've also probably kept a reflective log, and you might want to think back as to whether there's ever been any occasions where beliefs and values have impacted on your relationship with a coachee or a mentee. Some of the topics you could explore are around your own professional competence as a coach or mentor, looking at integrity, as we've mentioned, so things around confidentiality and when this might or might not need to be broken, also thinking about things around professionalism. Conflict of interest might be an area to explore. So for example, if you were coaching someone and they were discussing an individual that you knew well, it might be really difficult to maintain that objectivity and professionalism. So you could talk about that. For 3.3 and 4.3, just try and bring in lots of different examples from your practice. So now that we've discussed all the assessment criteria, let's move on to think about how you carry out your research. If you've watched one of these assessment briefings before and you feel confident with the sections that we're covering here, feel free to skip ahead. But it might serve as a good reminder. So let's look at where to start. The syllabus is always a really good place to start, and as I mentioned, there are always some helpful suggestions on different theories to look up and different aspects to include in your assessment. As I mentioned, you can find lots of really good resources on the CMI website, so on Management Direct. You can find details of how to access this if you've not accessed it before in your candidate handbook. In the back of your coaching and mentoring handbook, we also include a list of recommended reading. And of course, you have the textbook that we've provided you with, Coaching and Mentoring at Work by Connor and Pecora. So when you're carrying out your research, try to avoid relying on too few sources, but also don't overwhelm yourself with a huge amount of reading that's going to prevent you from getting started. Maybe to get started, you could research just a topic at a time. Avoid quoting Google or Wikipedia and try instead to find a reliable source or an original source. So moving on to talk about structure and presentation. You'll find a checklist as to what to include with your assessment in the candidate handbook. This is listed on page 23. If you can't find your candidate handbook, if you go on to the BOO website and click on the CMI section, you'll be able to find the latest copy of the candidate handbook there. Try and keep your structure really logical, outline it in advance, try and follow the assessment brief and use some of the headings from there. Try and show the assessor which assessment criteria you're addressing where in the assessment. Try and use headings and subheadings to guide the reader and break up really large paragraphs. Just try and have one key point per paragraph. You're welcome to use diagrams and tables where it supports your work, and these aren't counted in your word count, so they might help you there, but don't forget to reference them if they're from an external source. Also include an introduction, as I mentioned earlier, and in the introduction you might want to outline your organisation or, if relevant, the role. And your introduction isn't included in your word count. You can include appendices if you want to, but these won't be marked, and they're also not included in your word count. In terms of your writing style, try not to write in the first person unless it is a reflection. There are some reflections included in this assessment, and try and not pad out your assessment with waffle, and try and, if you can, just stick to plain English. Don't forget to proofread and sense check your work. In fact, it might be helpful to get someone else to do that for you. Also, obviously, spell check and grammar check your work. Really try and avoid paraphrasing too closely from your external sources, as this could look like plagiarism, which obviously isn't allowed. And we're going to look at referencing in more detail in another webinar, but we'll touch on it briefly shortly. Look at the overall word count for your assessment and try to budget your word count so you know roughly how many words are needed for each section. For example, if your assessment says 900 words maximum and you know that there are 3 assessment criteria to cover, then it's roughly 300 words per section. Try and pay attention to those command verbs though, because if you've got an evaluate versus an identify, you're going to need to allow a few more words for an evaluate type question. Try not to use lots more words on one criterion and too few on another, and remove any repetition. Try and stick to your word count if you can. You are able to go 10% over, but if it's a lot over the word count, it's likely to be sent back to you to reduce, and if your load's under the word count, you're not likely to have covered it in enough depth. If you are over the word count, just check how many words you've used in each criterion and reduce any of that over the budgeted word count before you submit it. As I mentioned, certain elements aren't included in the word count, so the introduction to your job role or organisation or department, an index page, a contents page and headings are not included, and neither are diagrams, charts or graphs. And any information that you include in your references aren't included, and neither is a bibliography. Or if you've used a reflective statement at the end of the assessment to draw together your learning, this also wouldn't be included. So there is a separate webinar on referencing, so you might want to watch that for more detail. But just in summary, just make sure that all external sources that you've quoted are referenced so that you avoid plagiarism. Try to use a recognised referencing system, for example Harvard-style referencing. You can find advice on this, as I said, on the webinar, or also looking on the CMI website, there is a guide to referencing. Try to use the original source where you can. There are some tools that really help you with referencing. There's a free tool called Cite This For Me that you might find useful, and Microsoft Word also has a handy tool that can help you present your references correctly and update them easily. And you'll be able to find help online for using this tool. So we've now come to the end of this assessment briefing, so just a quick reminder, really try and stick carefully to the assessment criteria and don't veer away from these. Pay attention to those command verbs, so things like evaluate or identify, and think about what the differences are in terms of what you're expected to do. Try and back up your work with examples from your reading and from your own organisation, but don't forget to reference and use the recognised referencing system. Use the syllabus to help you because it does give you some good guidance on the theory and content to include, and try and budget your word count. And the last thing to say is just good luck, and if you need any further help you can always get in touch with the team using the CMI email address as shown on the screen. Thank you for listening to this webinar and best of luck with your assessment.